But the cool thing also, but the amazing thing is that we also have access to function calling, which is great because it sort of gives us wings per se, which allows us to create our own tools, right? Meaning we can create functions that will be able to fetch data somewhere or do something and then retrieve that information and push it back to the large language model, in this case, the OpenAI models, and the assistants can then do what it needs to do. So this is the part that we are going to be look into in these upcoming lessons. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be building this summarizer application, at least a little demo so you understand what's going on. All right, so this is the app. It's called News Summarizer. So essentially, this will allow you to enter any topic. I could say, for instance, vaccine, and then I can run the assistant. So what will happen here in the back end, it's going to go and tap into a function, a function calling, a function that was created, which is going to be called by assistant. And that function is actually going to get an API, a news API, pull the news that have this topic, vaccine, and then summarize everything for us. And as you can see, we have here are some news articles on the topic of vaccines. And then we have this other headline here. And the great thing is that we also can click here to go to see more of those news about whatever is that is being talked about. So it's very cool. And so it gives you some sort of a summary. And at the end, of course, I added this run steps, which just logs out the run steps from the assistant, as we've seen before. Okay, it's very cool. So this is exactly what we're going to be building. I can also enter another topic here. Let's say Bitcoin. Why not? And it's going to go ahead and run. This is actually a Streamlit application, which I'll show you how to put together. It's very simple if you've never heard of or never even done anything with Streamlit. It's very cool. Okay, so it's running, as you can see here, and it takes a bit, of course, because it's pulling all that information, calling that function, and then retrieving that information, and then pull it back to the AI. Okay, so there we go. We have here are some articles on the topic Bitcoin. It tells us exactly what's going on, gives some descriptions. So this is what we're going to be building, and let's go ahead and get started. So we need to go ahead and get an API key in order for us to be able to get this application going. So let's go to newsapi.org. As you see here, this is where you are going to go ahead to either log in if you already have a login, or go ahead and say get API from here or from down here. But if you want to learn a little bit more about what is happening here, it's a very simple articles or news API that allows you to fetch data. For instance, if you add a topic such as Tesla, as you can see here in this URL, then you get something like this. So a JSON that allows us to go and probe in and get information pertaining to that topic. So which is exactly what we want in this application. So it's very simple. Go ahead and say get the API. And the thing you need to do is to register in order for you to get an API. So you put your first name, your last name, and then choose a password. Make sure if you are an individual or a business, I'll just go with an individual. I think that's the easiest. And of course, you have the captcha here, agree and submit. So I'm not going to do that because I already have that API. So once you have the API, of course, as we did before, go ahead and save that API because we're going to use it shortly in our application. I have created already this news summarizer. So I've got the environment going. I have everything. I also have the requirements .txt with python.env and OpenAI, of course. And I'm going to say pip install -r, pass the requirement of text, and go ahead and make sure that we have all of that installed. Okay, again, if you go to my env bin, you can see we should have .env as well as OpenAI set up for us. So the main folder or the main file, as you see here, it is essentially the same setup we had before. Okay, so just copy and paste. We have the client, instantiated our OpenAI here, and passing the model. Of course, remember, we could change this model here to perhaps GPT-4, depending on when you're watching this video. I'm using the 3.5 Turbo 16K because that's all we need anyway, but feel free to change that. Okay, so we have all of these imported. Nothing new here. So if you click here, you can see that I have the OpenAPI key. And what we'll do next is you need to add the other key, which is going to be the News API key. So here, then you can put like that and put your API key, the API key that you created. So once we have all of that, let's go back to our main, in this case to our main.py or app.py. And I'm going to put here this code. So it's going to be news API, OS environment. Of course, we need to make sure that we import OS for that as well. And then it should be good. So here we are getting the news API we just created, put that into a news API key so we can use and set things up in a little bit. Okay, so once you have all of that, we should be able to get going. Now, what I'm going to do next here, I'm going to create a class that will be our manager per se, our assistant manager, which will allow us to call it and then get the assistants or create the assistant, the thread ID, and do all the things that we've seen before. Okay, so I think that's the better way to do it. Of course, we could do this in a more modular way, create the functions and do what we did before, but I think this is kind of fun. And also keep in mind that you will have access to all of this code, so it's all good. So in the bottom here, I'm going to put this piece of code, which allows us, of course, to pick up the main function. I'm going to create it here and then run whatever is here. So for now, I'm just going to say pass so that we don't have any issues. So let's go ahead and create a function, which is going to allow us to tap into the API and get some result. That is the base of this entire application. So that is the first thing we need to do. So I'm going to say get news, say define or def to define, and then I'm going to pass here the topic, which is going to be the topic we're going to pass. So first I'm going to put the URL here. So the URL that we need to tap into, essentially it's our API. So I have it already, and I'm going to put it inside of an F string and just go ahead and grab it. So essentially what I'm doing here, I have the HTTPS newsapi.org. And in this case here, the endpoint that I want is everything. Okay, there are different endpoints, but we can just focus on everything. And you can go back to the API page, which I will recommend you do, to read a little bit more about all these endpoints and everything. But this should suffice. And then you have a query here and pass the topic, which is going to be passed along here. And then the API key, which is the news API key that we put together right at the top here. And of course, we're saying page size about 5 because we don't want to get more than that, because that's just a little bit too much. All right. And you can play around with the numbers and everything. That's totally fine and up to you. Now, the next thing we need to do here is let's go back to our requirements txt, and I need to pass a request package here because we're going to need that to hit our API, do the request to our API, and then get the information. Okay. So let's go ahead and say pip install. Oops. Let's say pip install -r requirement of text. Voila. And we should be good. We go back here. Now I can go ahead and say try, put all of that inside of a try. And I'm going to say accept at the bottom here. Require a request. Oh, I actually have to import requests. So import requests as such, the package. And now I can use the requests and then exception, request exception, SE. This is just to save us, this makes a requests. And I'm just going to say print, or rather say error occurred during API request. Something like that. Okay, and then pass the E. So don't worry too much. It's just an exception here because we're going to put some code inside of the try here so that if something happens, at least we have a way of handling our errors, right? Probably there are better ways of doing this, but this is fine. All right, so now inside here, we are going to do the fetching of the response from our API. I'm going to put in a response variable, and I'm going to say requests .get in this case and pass the URL. That's how easy really it is to use requests to go and fetch some data from the API. So now that we have a response here, I'm going to put some if statements here just to make sure things are okay. So I'm going to say if response status, because the response will have this status code in this case. If our status code is okay, in this case it's just 200, which means everything okay. And then I'm going to be able to parse through our JSON. So I'm going to say news, and then I'm going to transform that into JSON, which means we need to import JSON as such. I'm going to say JSON dumps, and I'm going to pass our response .json as such. And of course I can say indentation about 4 as the JSON comes in, so to make the actual JSON looks a little bit better. Okay, we have our object here, which is going to be our payload with all the news. So the next thing we will do here, just to make things simpler, is we are going to transform this JSON here. We say JSON dumps, which if you hover over what it says here, it says serialize object to a JSON format string. So this is just a format JSON string. Now we need to actually convert that string into a Python dictionary. That way we're going to be able to access some of the fields easily. So I'm just going to say news JSON, and then use JSON package again and say loads, and then pass our new, this should be news, not new, but either way works. Okay, pass our news here. All right, there we go. So now this is easy for us to work with, which is exactly what we want. And then I'm going to say data. I'm going to say news JSON here, just to pass things around a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and here I'm going to go ahead and access all the fields, essentially loop through, right? Loop through the JSON and extract all the things that we want. Okay, so if we go back to the news API, of course we have to get started, documentation, everything. But if you look here, you can see the payload, how it looks, right? So all the payload will more or less look like this, okay, which is really cool. And also you can scroll left and down. You can scroll left to see different endpoints, top headlines. We have here top headlines still. And there we go. This is the everything endpoint that we are using, and with some modification to get the data that we're looking for. And so it will look essentially the same. The payload, you can see here we have status. It's an object, a JSON object. So in this case, it's just an object. We have the status, okay, results, 254. And then we have this articles array, which then we have the source and the author. So each article is an object itself with all the information and has author, title, description, and URL to image, and all of these fields. Okay, so we're going to extrapolate some of these fields so that we can get the information that we need, because we don't need everything from these from the payload. So essentially we're going to loop through our payload and get and access the fields and get the information that we actually need. So before we even go through the for loop, let's go ahead and get some of the most important fields. So I'm going to start with status, and this status is going to be we're going to get from data and go to status field here. So you can see we have the object, go to status and get the status field. In this case, you're just going to say okay. Okay, we got that, and let's get the total results. In this case, I'm going to say it's going to be data, and then I believe it's just total. We're going down here and get the total result, which will say how many articles are in this payload. And then we're going to go to articles to get the actual articles. So we're going to go through data again. We're going back to get this array, which will contain all of the articles as objects or dictionary in Python. Okay, so we just say articles. So this is exactly what we want. Make sure that these names are exactly the same, because these are our fields, which are our IDs for us to be able to get what we need. I think I got everything right. So I got all the articles. So now is when I'm going to loop through the articles and get the information that I want. So the first thing I'm going to say for article in articles, very simple loop here. So what we want to do is, again, go and get the information that we want from each article. What we want is the source and get the name, and then we may need the author, the title of the article, of course, and the description. We may need some other things here. So, and we may need the content on other things. So we're just going to go ahead and extrapolate a few of these fields. Name, in this case, is going to be going to articles, or article in this case for each article, and I'm going to go to source and go through and get the name. All right, do the same to others. So I'm going to get the author. So article, author, and title. There we go. And what else? I need description, which is going to be article and description. And what else? Let's get the URL because we may need that, the URL to the article itself. And it's going to be URL. Okay, let's go ahead and get the content. Okay, what else? So that's good. Then here at the bottom, I'm going to put all that into a string, so it's easy for us to use it. So I'm going to say, call this title, description. I'm going to put all of that into an F string just to facilitate everything, really. And then here's what's going to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and concatenate all of these different pieces that we put together here, we received, into a long, nice string. So first I'm going to put the title and then put a text title that says title first. And then I'm going to say author. So get the author field that we just got from here. And what else? Let's go ahead and get, let's say source name in this case, and description, and let's go ahead and get URL. Okay, so now we have this long string that has all this information that we pulled from the API. Looking good. And the next thing we'll do here is that I'm going to actually put that into an array, because each one of these string that contains title, author, source name, description, URL, we know that we're inside of a for loop. We want to do that for each one of these articles that we're getting. And so I'm going to go ahead and create an empty list here, say final news. That way I can pass all of that each time we'll loop through. Okay, so right below here, I'm going to say final news. I'm going to append our description. So title, description. Maybe I should have named it better, but that's okay. Okay, so each time we do that, we are going to pull in all of the title description, which we are getting all of the title, author, source name, description, and URL for each article as we loop through. Okay, all of that, so that way we can actually return that array, so we see all of the information, in this case, all of the news that we want. So at the bottom here, I'm going to go ahead and just say return the final news. Okay, let me go ahead and move this, because this is an if statement. I can say return else. In this case, if indeed response status code is not 200, meaning we have some issues, we're just going to go ahead and return, in this case, an empty array or list like this. All right, very good. So what we'll do now is let's go ahead and call our get news and pass a topic here that says Bitcoin, just to see what will happen. Let's go ahead and quickly run this. So I'm going to say Python 3. I am on Mac, so on Windows or Linux, you have to do something else, I believe. And let's call main. Let's give it a run. Hopefully everything works. Looks like it's running, but it's not showing anything. That is because I need to actually put that into a variable, say news, and then say print news like this. Okay, let's see if this works. Let's run again. And as you see, we're getting some information. And the great thing is, because if it's an array that we should be getting, yes, a list, I keep saying array, it's a list in Python, but same thing. You can see we have the square brackets there. And of course, I can go ahead and get just the first item in our list if I wish to do so. And let's run again. We should get just one. So we can see exactly that we have a title and description, author, source, and all that great stuff in URL. And that's exactly what we want. So there we go. So we have all the articles that we want. We just got the pieces that we want and created one long string and put that in an array each time we call get news. So this is good news. I think this says that this tells us that we're able to fetch news from our API and get the data that we want for what we're going to be doing next. So now that we know that the get news works, by the way, we'll see later, this get news, this is the function that we're going to be using. You will see in a bit here as the function calling functionality we talk about with Assistance API, which is pretty cool. Okay. So now we have that working, we're able to pass in this case, a topic, and then we receive the news, right? And then we formatted everything, we got what we need, and all is good. So we're going to use that as our function calling. Very cool. All right. So next what we'll do here is, as I said before, we are going to actually create a class. This is going to be a manager, an assistant manager class, where we're going to put everything in that one class. Okay. So now we could have done this just putting functions, modularly, but this is, I think, is the best way. Okay, to do it. This is probably the better way for us to have everything in one place, in one class, so we can instantiate that class as an object and then get what we want from that. Let's do that. So I'm going to create a class here. So say class and call this assistant manager such. All right, very good. And so I'm going to add a few fields for our class here. The first field that we need is going to be the thread ID. And for now, I'm going to say none. And then I need the assistant ID, which is also going to be none, like this. Have a constructor or initializer, depending on which programming language you're coming from. So we're going to say define, and this is going to be the init, and it passed the self, and it's returning, in this case, nothing. Just to simplify things, of course, I'm going to pass a few parameters here. So it's going to self. I'm going to pass also the model, which is going to be a string. Okay. And just in case, I'm just going to go ahead and pass our model that we passed at the top here. We created at the top here. We have a default value, which is going to be the model GPT-3 or whatever model you added here. And I'm just going to remove that. And next, I am going to then set up a few things for our class here in our constructor, in our initializer. Okay. So I'm going to say self. And I'm going to call the client because I want the client to be, in this case, OpenAI. That OpenAI as such, just to instantiate all of that. Or I could have just called our client here. That would work as well. So either way it works. I'm just going to pass client like this, which is going to be, in this case, our client. And then, of course, self.model. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and say model, whatever we're passing along here, and then self, what else? That assistant is going to be none in the beginning, and self.thread also is going to be none, and self.run, right, is none as well. The other thing I'm going to add here, because I want to be able to have the actual summary, because that's the whole goal, is that this class is going to be able to give us the summary of the news from the topic that we paste in or enter. So I'm going to create, yes, another field here called summary, okay, which in the beginning is going to be equal to none, like that. So now we're going to do some if statements here to actually check if some of these fields like assistant and thread, but more particularly if these static fields here, thread ID and assistant IDs, if they're existent, that way we can then look at that and see whether we need to create a new assistant or just use the existing ID. Because the idea is that as we run this the first time, as you saw before, we will have the assistant ID at least, as well as a third ID, and so that we don't run this many times and then recreate the same things in the backend in the console or in the playground. We want to make sure that those things are set up so that we don't have copies of the assistant and IDs and so forth. So still inside of our init here, I'm going to say if assistant manager, dot thread. In this case, let's start with assistant ID. So if we have an assistant ID, that means we have an assistant. In that case, we are going to set our assistant to the assistant that we already have. So I'm going to say self dot client dot beta assistants, and then I'm going to retrieve that assistant. And to retrieve that assistant, we need to say pass, of course, the ID of that assistant. So we're just going to say assistant ID is equal to manager, assistant manager, and get that assistant ID as such. And also we're going to check for our thread ID, just if we have a thread ID. So assistant manager dot thread ID. If that's the case, we're going to do the same thing we did, which is we're going to go ahead and get the thread ID. So self assistant, or thread ID, I should say, and set that up with the self.client beta threads, and retrieve, in this case, thread ID. It's going to be to assistant manager, or I could have said self, but that's okay. Thread ID as such. Okay. All right. Very good. So now we are making sure that indeed, if we have an assistant ID, then we don't create a new assistant ID. In this case, we just go ahead and retrieve the assistant that we have. Okay. The same thing with the thread ID. Okay. So all of that is inside of our init function here, our constructor. Next, we're going to define a new method here called create assistant. So this will allow us to create an actual assistant. So I'm going to pass self, name, and instructions, as well as tools, because those are the things that any assistant, as you know by now, may need when we create an assistant. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go ahead and put an if statement here. So if not self, that assistant, right? So if there's no assistant, of course, then what I'm going to do, I'm going to create an assistant. Let's say assistant object, essentially, which is going to be self that client that beta that assistance, and then I'm going to create a new assistance, essentially. So to do that, we need to pass name, which is going to be name. We need to pass the instructions, which is going to be instructions that we are passing along, right? And then we're going to pass also tools, and pass the tools as such. And for completion, we're also going to pass model, and we're going to say self.model. So to get the model that we already have in our constructor, in our class at the top there. Okay, very good. So that's how we would create an assistant if we didn't have an assistant. Okay, so now that we know that we've created the assistant object here, next I'm going to say assistant manager. That assistant ID, I'm going to grab that ID, and then I'm going to get that from our assistant object, that ID, like that. And then I'm going to make sure that the class field has that ID, okay, the assistant's ID. So I'm going to use self assistant is going to, and then I'm going to set up the assistant field, which is usually none in the beginning, to the assistant that we just created here, which is going to be this assistant object, right? So self, that assistant now is equal to our assistant object. Very good. So if you want, we can just print things out here so that we can debug and see what's going on. So I'm going to say assist ID, just put something more there so we can see what's going on. And then I'm going to put, say, self.assist ID. Oh, actually, I could just go assistant.id like this, right, to get to the actual assistant ID when that is created. That's why we're saying this. All right. Very good. And that's it for create assistant. Okay, so next what we'll do is we are going to then define another function or method in this case. This is going to be called create thread. Of course, I'm going to pass self. So we have that reference as such. So you can see really nothing is out of this world. The process is still the same. It's just that I've changed a few things so that we have an actual class that helps do all the things in one place, so we can just instantiate that class and get what we need. All right, so the same thing really. If not, in this case, self that thread. So if there's nothing there, then that means we need to create a thread object. Okay, So something self.client, and then threads, and then I'm going to create a thread. And as you know now, to create a thread, we just need to pass, we don't actually need to pass anything, which actually I'm going to just leave as is. So we're going to create an object thread, and we can attach messages and whatever we need later. All right. So now that we have that thread, we're going to use Assistant Manager, just like what we did before, and say thread ID. It's going to be equal to thread object.id. Okay, set that up, and then we're going to set the field, the class field, self.thread, okay, to be equal to the thread object. Again, we're going to go ahead and print f string here. I can say thread ID, just to make things better, and just pass here self.thread.id. All right, so just print that out so we have it and make sure that we are getting what we need. So now we have created the create assistant method. We also have, in this case, the create thread method. Now we need to add messages to that thread. So I'll define another function here. Say add message to thread. Okay, so we're going to pass here, first of all, self reference and the role, as well as the content. All right, in order to create that message, because we know messages are added into a thread, so we need to make sure that we indeed have a thread ID. So I'm going to say if self.thread, we have that, and then we're going to go ahead and self.client beta.threads messages, and we're going to create that message. All right, to create that message, we need the thread ID, which is going to be, in this case, self.thread.id, and then we need the role, which is going to be the role, okay, which is going to be passing when we call this create a message or add message to thread, as well as the content, okay, and pass the content as such, which has been passed along. That's it. All right, so we have that function, or in this case a method, and next we need, of course, a way for us to run the assistant. So I'm going to find another method here. So this is going to be run assistant, and we're going to pass self-reference and instructions as well. Okay, so how do we do that? Again, we're going to check. It's always important to check, because in order to run an assistant, we need, of course, to check if there's a thread ID as well as the assistant. Okay, so if self.thread and self.assistant, if they are existent, then we are safe to run this thread. So self